I want to say thank you to Lunar and David for inviting me and for organizing this, and particularly to Mohammed, who is one of those very, very dear friends that I've only gotten to see in person 3 times and never twice in the same city. I'm very sorry not to be able to visit Hong Kong. I was supposed to come in March, and as you can imagine, those plans got put on hold, but I'm glad that we can do this anyway through the medium of Zoom. Uh, Good morning, good day, good evening to you if you're in my time zone, good late at night if you're on the East Coast. I want to start with a view from May of 2016, when Emirates Airline, the airline based in Dubai, inaugurated a new direct route from Dubai to mainland China. It was the 4th direct flight from Dubai to mainland China. Emirates already served Beijing, Shanghai, and Guangzhou. And now they added the city of Yinchuan. Yinchuan is a city of about 1.5 million people. It's the capital of the Ningxia Autonomous Region. And if you're looking at an outline map of China, it's in north central China. But if you're looking at a map of where most people in China live, it's in northwestern China. And the addition of this route meant that Emirates now served the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 71st most populous urban areas in mainland China. Yinchuan at the time was being widely promoted in the Middle East, and particularly in the Persian Gulf region, as quote unquote a cultural tourism destination. That is, you could take a package tour and go to Beijing and see the Great Wall, go to Xi'an and see the terracotta warriors, and then go to Yinchuan and look around. And at the time, Yinchuan was undergoing a rapid transformation, a building boom. Of course, everywhere in China was undergoing a building boom, but this was a building boom with Arab characteristics, to the point where the street signs in Yinchuan at the time were trilingual. They showed the name of the street in Chinese, in English, and in Arabic. Now, if you were to go to Yinchuan, you wouldn't find this anymore, because rather abruptly in 2018, as the Chinese government's attitude toward expressions of religiosity in general, and Islam in particular, was changing, almost overnight, the street signs were returned to just being in Chinese and English. There are many, many other aspects of Yinchuan's transformation, both before 2018 and since then, some of which I'll talk about later on. But the thing that interests me as somebody who particularly pays attention to China's relations with countries in the Middle East, particularly Arab countries, is Yinchuan's status as a site for cultural diplomacy. Not necessarily with diplomats representing foreign governments, but as a place that delegations of professors and journalists and children's groups and women's groups and entertainers and people of all walks of life can come and see a particular vision of what China represents or could represent. And I'm interested in how that Chinese approach to cultural diplomacy has changed over time and continues to change. In order to talk about that, I want to begin by looking backwards, look back and talk initially about some of the People's Republic of China's first overtures to the Middle East back in the 1950s, then come into the 21st century and talk about both sides of that 2018 divide, and ask questions about how that how the strategies have changed, but also about what's remained the same. And I think there's a lot that has remained the same. And in particular, I want to talk about the role of Chinese Muslims in Chinese cultural outreach. Now, I gather that we have a bit of a mixed audience tonight. We're going to have people who are very familiar with Chinese minority policy and have studied it in great detail. And we're going to have people who are totally new to the topic. So I want to take a little bit of time just to talk about some of the very basics of Chinese minority policy so that we're all on the same page, and to highlight some aspects of it that'll be particularly important. So China is a multi-ethnic country, of which the predominant ethnicity, that Han Chinese, comprises somewhere more than 90% of the population. In the early to mid 1950s, which is to say very soon after the establishment of the People's Republic of China, the government decided that it would be a good idea to count exactly how many other nationalities lived in China. That process took a little while. The numbers changed a little bit for a while, but for a long time, they've been steady at 56. That is the Han majority and 55 minorities. And each of these nationalities, we can translate it, maybe ethnicities, are known as minzu. The process of going and determining exactly how many there were and which there were relied on four main criteria. That is, in order to be a minzu, you were supposed to have a common language, a common territory, common economic life, and common identity and common customs. Notably, religion is not a criterion here. This was a Marxist idea. It was derived from Marxist ideas about social science, as well as Stalin's ideas about nationalities. And except in as much as religion can be subsumed into the realm of customs, it's just not something that is meant to define a minzu. And the most important idea here is some notion of common descent. That is, you belong to the minzu of your parents and their parents and their parents, going back a long way. Now, these criteria identified 10 minzus that are predominantly Muslim, of which 2 are by far the biggest, with more than 10 million people apiece. And those are the Uyghurs and the Hui. Now, the Uyghurs fit very easily into these criteria. That is, they speak a common language, Uyghur, and they live in a common territory for the most part, which is the region of Xinjiang in northwestern China. But Hui Muslims don't fit very well. When we say Hui Muslims, what we mean is basically Muslims in China who speak Mandarin Chinese and or other Chinese dialects, and essentially are ethnically very similar to Han Chinese. But there is a notion, however distant, of shared descent. So the sort of origin story is that way back in the early years of Islam, the 7th and 8th centuries, there were Arab and Persian traders who came to the seaports of southern and eastern China and married local women and established these communities. This was before Islam had traveled overland from Central Asia. And this notion of a kinship link between Hui communities and people in the Middle East is interesting because it's something that can be trotted out, but it's also something that can be modified. So if you have a person from the Arab world, you'll often see people explain to that visitor that Chinese Hui Muslims are descended from early Arab traders. And if you have a mixed audience of people who are from different Middle Eastern countries, then you're more likely to see people say that this group is descended from Arab and Persian traders. That is, there's a little bit of of changing how it's presented with the kind of ambiguity of the Minzu criteria comes some flexibility in how it can be presented to foreigners. But in many senses, the Hui don't fit very easily into Chinese minority policy. They're spread all around the country, and they don't really speak a common language that's distinct from the Han majority. That is, they speak Chinese. Except there's this notion based on this idea of common descent that there may or may not, depending on the context, be some sort of inherent affinity of Hui Muslims in China for the Arabic language. And my sense is that over time, people in China and the Chinese government itself have been very inconsistent about the extent to which they are comfortable recognizing Arabic as something that that Hui Muslims are supposed to feel an affinity for. So sometimes, particularly in the mid 1950s, and particularly in the 2010s before 2018, you see people emphasizing that it's important for Hui Muslims to learn Arabic. But then other times, particularly after 1958 or after 2018, you see articles saying, no, 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 the common language of Hui Muslims is Mandarin. These inconsistencies come out in conversations with Arab visitors. And it's very interesting to chart some of the ways that people talk about these things. Now, I said I wanted to go back to the 1950s, and this is a time when Yinchuan was really not on the map for visitors. And I want to talk briefly about what was on the map. One of the things that I do when I teach history, whether it's about China or anywhere else, is I ask my students to think about if you were the government of some country and people were coming to visit your country, where would you take them? What would you want to show up? Whom would you want them to meet? What would you want to say there? Because I think that by looking at what aspects of a country the people who lived there wanted foreigners to experience, you can learn a lot about how they saw their country. There was a dramatic uptick after 1953, particularly after the end of the Korean War, in foreigners from all over the world who were coming to China to look around, to see what the People's Republic of China had built in the 4+ years since it had been established. And there's been some scholarship. There was some scholarship at the time, and there's been more since on where visitors went. What was the standard itinerary, as it was. Most people who were not from the communist world tended to come through Hong Kong. They went to Hong Kong, and then they crossed into China, into Guangzhou, and they took the train from there to Beijing, which used to take a long time. And along the way, they stopped at various places, particularly emphasizing heavy industry. Things like oil refineries, concrete plants, truck factories. They also visited a lot of prisons. And in many cases, the trips were timed for major holidays, particularly National Day in October or May Day in May. That is, there was going to be a massive parade in Tiananmen Square in Beijing, and the visitors were expected to be there in time to see China at its choreographed best. There's one particular story that I like of a journalist from Le Monde, the French newspaper, who contacted the Chinese consulate in, I think it's Switzerland, and said, I'd like to visit China. And this was in September, and he got a reply that said, you can have a visa to come to China. You must be in Beijing in time for the National Day parades, which at that point were only a couple weeks away. And so he got his passport, processed very quickly and had to get on the plane almost immediately because the Chinese government really emphasized being there for the holidays. And people didn't tend to go very far west. they were going from Guangzhou to Beijing. Maybe they would go to Manchuria, where there was a lot of heavy industry to see. Um, there's an oil refinery in Gansu province in Yumen City that was about as far west as anybody got. Um, so the areas that we would think of as traditionally Muslim areas of China were not really on the radar screen for people who were coming from the United States and Europe. But they were a little bit on the radar screen for people who were coming from the Middle East. And so we have to pay attention to what the standard itinerary was if you're an Arab Muslim who's coming to China in the 1950s. And the very first thing, almost invariably, is you cross the border from Hong Kong into Guangzhou, and you see a mosque. You see the Huizhou Mosque in Guangzhou. Here's what it looks like. Guangzhou had a very early Hui Muslim community, and it has one of these great traditional Chinese style mosques with the traditional Chinese style architecture, and then here another minaret behind it. And in Huaisheng Mosque has a great story. It's referred to as the mosque of the longing for the prophet. That is, people who knew that they were never going to make it back to Mecca, built a mosque in a new country. And this was the first stop on the tour, as it were. Again, there was emphasis on being in China for holidays, a slight tweak of the same formula that was applied to non-Muslims. But in this case, the holiday that a lot of people came to China for was Eid al-Fitr at the end of Ramadan. And so in 1955 and in 1956, and years like that, you see delegations of foreign Muslims who were taken to Urumqi. Urumqi is the capital of the Xinjiang region. Now, as I said, one of the characteristics of the Minzu system is that each Minzu has a common territory. And so in China, gradually areas were established that are at least theoretically autonomous, governed by members of a particular minority. If you have a very large minority, you can have a region, and then you can have a county or a prefecture or whatever, depending on sort of the size and scope of your Minzu. And in, between Eid al-Fitr of 1955 and Eid a year later in 1956, Xinjiang was created as the autonomous region for the Uyghur Minzu. And so that meant that Xinjiang was the place that foreign Muslims went because it was important for the CCP to emphasize to these visitors that there was some form of autonomy and self-rule for Muslims within China. And Urumqi, as the capital, took on kind of special significance. In 1955, the Egyptian Minister of Pious Endowments, Ahmed Hassan al-Baquri, became the first cabinet member of the Egyptian government to travel to China. And he went to Urumqi for Eid al-Fitr and wrote in his memoir that it left a very positive impression on him, and wrote in an article for an official Egyptian publication that Urumqi, where he had spent the holiday, was the capital of Islamic and Arabic culture in China, which is a very interesting phrase because Urumqi, which was established as a Qing dynasty garrison town, had never had a Uyghur majority, and certainly nothing about it was Arab. But that was how it was presented to him, and that's how he allowed himself to see it. He was told repeatedly, or at least he wrote that he was told, that Chinese Muslims studied Arabic in government-run schools, which wasn't really true. But it was the case that that a lot of people spoke Arabic. And for visitors from the West, there was this kind of absolute ironclad restriction on anybody speaking English with foreign visitors. It was only the translators. But at least for Arab visitors, there was so much importance placed on the notion that Chinese Muslims were able to get an education in Arabic, that people who had the skills were given permission and encouraged to talk to Arab visitors in Arabic. So going back to the 1950s, there's so much emphasis placed on the linguistic inclinations of Chinese Muslims to learn Arabic as something that they have in common with other places in the Islamic world. Now, moving forward a bit to the 21st century, it sounds very odd, I think, to you today for me to say that Urumqi in Xinjiang was the place where the Chinese government was keen for foreign Muslim visitors to go. And in the 2010s, as the Chinese government was eager to present the Hui as a kind of more assimilated, more palatable vision of what Chinese Islam could be, Ningxia, where Yinchuan is, the region, autonomous region set aside for the Hui Muslim community, became the place to go. And I wanted to show you the most elaborate part of Yinchuan as it was designed for visitors from the Middle East. This is the Hui Culture Park. It is a theme park about Hui Islam. This photo is from 2016. And one thing you'll note is that this park was under construction. This park was always under construction. It was always expanding, always changing, always being renovated. When I visited it for the first time in 2015, there's scaffolding everywhere. Some of the reflecting pools were drained. It was always in a state of kind of constant change. But you see from this photo just how dramatic the size was. You have local Hui youths, many of whom spoke Arabic, whose job was to show visitors around. This is a promotional photo from a pageant, this kind of nighttime festival of lights and colors that was put on at the park based on the 1001 Nights story. I didn't get to see it because even though the pageant had cost some 200 million Chinese yuan to put on, it was only running a few months out of the year. And even though I was there in August in what should have been a pretty high tourist season, this park was empty. This is a photo showing some of the construction, and it shows a building in the Hui Culture Park that fulfills an interesting role. That is, it's sort of a mosque. It's not a mosque, but it's made to look like a mosque, but it's called a palace. But when you go inside, here's another view of it. When you go inside, it's meant to look like a mosque, and you have the opportunity as a visitor, as you would if you went to a mosque, to put on an abaya, some sort of modest clothing to cover your hair, to act like you're going into a mosque. But then also, they're insistent that this is a palace and no worship takes place there. It's this sort of ambiguous kind of a setup that gives non-Muslim visitors the impression of what a mosque might be like. You also have, as they called it, the first street of Hui culture. These photos are from a little bit after I went there, but this park is empty. It was meant to attract visitors from all over the world. but it really wasn't. But Yinchuan was also developing in other ways. I've shown you the street signs. They were expanding the airport. They were building conference centers. They were building visible edifices of Arab influence throughout the city. And every other September, that is in September of odd numbered years, there is still the excuse me, the China Arab States Expo, a big conference basically held in Yinchuan, and all these sort of side things. The tour guides have an expo, and the exporters of whatever have an expo, and the exporters of this, and you can come together, make deals. Yinchuan was promoting itself as a place for, as China's gateway to the Arab world. Now, I want to identify a couple of interesting things about this. One is that the impulse to identify Yinchuan as a place for Arab influence in China came from a variety of different places, including the regional level. That is, the region is trying to take advantage of the notion of a Silk Road promoted by the government to get investment coming in. And Yinchuan wasn't the only region that was doing this. So you had, for instance, Shandong province in eastern China is openly courting Japanese investment. Heilongjiang province in way northeastern China presents itself as a destination for Russian investment. And Yinchuan was getting in on the act the way that it could. And the Hui Culture Park was one of these kinds of, there was some public funding, but it was really one particular local Hui Muslim guy who had driven the construction of it. And it's an instance of a person being enthusiastic about a government policy, in this case, the New Silk Road, that gave his community, in this case, the Hui, a special role in China's outreach. And it's not the only instance of a Hui Muslim person in China being enthusiastic about the Silk Road in a manner that that leads him into doing something ambitious. There's also a story of a guy in Fujian province in eastern China who started his own museum of the maritime Silk Road that is emphasizing the fact that Muslim traders had come to southeastern China because he was excited about a version of the official narrative that would put his community at the center of the narrative. And people were coming to Yinchuan, people who were funded by various entities, either of the party or other institutions or local institutions or whatever, were coming to Yinchuan, and we're getting a kind of 21st century version of the standard itinerary. Only now you're looking around downtown Yinchuan and you're going to the Hui Culture Park, and then you're going to a local mosque. And there's choice here. You want to take a foreign visitor to a local mosque, where do you take them? Well, there's lots of mosques. Yinchuan happens to be home in downtown Yinchuan to one of the largest mosques in China, the Nan Guan Mosque. And it looked like this. This wasn't where they went. Again and again and again, as you read what Arab delegations, groups, or whoever came to Yinchuan and wrote the story for their press back in their country of what did they see, they weren't going here. They were going to the Najihu Mosque. And this is a mosque in the traditional Chinese style, sort of like the Huizhou Mosque that I showed you earlier. This kind of pagoda-like architecture with the curved roof and a minaret that isn't in what in China would be called the Arab style, with the domes and things like that. Why would you take a visitor here? Well, that's because you want to emphasize that Islam is indigenous to China somehow, that it has a long history in the particular place. And this was the case in the 50s, in the 2010s, even at a time when Yinchuan was being widely shown off. The imam of the Najihu Mosque is one of these guys who's very much on the guest entertainment circuit. You bring the delegation to him and he gives the same speech that he gives to every delegation about how great it is that the Chinese government has provided for the rebuilding of this mosque. Now, I should just note here that the reason it needed to be rebuilt was because it was used as a ball bearing factory during the Cultural Revolution. This kind of encounter worked. And if you look in publications by Arab visitors to Yinchuan, they will quote almost verbatim people who visited at different times, almost verbatim what they were told in the Najihu Mosque, and praise the government's support for Islam in China. This is the message that was getting out in the 50s and in the 2010s. Also, enthusiasm about how many people in, this is an interior shot of the mosque, enthusiasm about how many people in Yinchuan were learning Arabic. And in 2016, the official estimates were that 3,000 locals were learning Arabic, including 1,200 at a single language school just south of Yinchuan. This is a photo that was taken in 2016 inside one of these Arabic language classrooms. That is, there's a huge groundswell of popular enthusiasm, of people, of Hui Muslim people in Yinchuan embracing the special role that they've been granted and saying, yeah, we want to be our country's ambassadors to the Middle East. We want to learn Arabic and embrace that role. And then in 2018, everything changed very quickly. Government concerns about expressions of Islam suddenly applied to all of China, not just to Xinjiang. And one of the things that was particularly prevalent and prominent was the government not wanting displays of the Arabic language. It was a crackdown first and foremost on Arabic, because if you're supposed to emphasize that Chinese Muslims are Chinese first and foremost, you want to be careful about foreign influence. One of the ways that this manifested itself virtually overnight in the early spring of 2018 is that halal restaurants that had Arabic writing on them had to cover it up. And particularly if you write the word halal in Arabic, that needed to be replaced by qingzhan, the same word, but in Chinese translation. So there's all these photos from early 2018 of, in this case, whitewash over the Arabic writing with qingzhan remaining at the top. Or here you see at the very top of this picture, the word halal has been covered over in white paint. Or in this one, it's stickers, people putting up the stickers over the Arabic word halal, leaving just the Chinese qingzhan. And not just Arabic, but architecture became a big target. And Yinchuan, which had so much Arab style, as they would say, architecture, became a huge target for this campaign. This is a photo from 2018 of a dome that was taken off of a hotel that was trying to cater to Arab visitors. And there are many, many instances of the city changing. This is basically the same view, minus the reflecting pool. The crescent moon with Arabic calligraphy has been taken down and replaced by a circle with traditional Chinese symbolism. In this case, 5 little small domes on the top of this gateway were taken down. And in this case, you see this dome in the background That was taken down, and under construction, you see a kind of more traditional Chinese style pagoda. There was a lot of concern. So there have since been changes to the Hui Culture Park as well. And this is, as I said, it's always being renovated. So it's a little hard to get photos that illustrate exactly what the changes are. But satellite photos do a pretty good job. So this is December 2019. You can see right here the gold domes of this building that is sort of a mosque, but not really a mosque. And then if you look in the same place a year later, it's been replaced by a kind of Chinese style pagoda. This is a mosque. By the summer of 2018, there were a lot of concerns, rumors that mosques that were in the Arab, quote unquote, Arab style were going to be demolished. This is a protest in front of the mosque by the local community, protesting the rumor that the mosque will be demolished. This is the Huizhou Grand Mosque. And you can see that the tone of the protest was very patriotic. That is, the protesters were carrying Chinese flags, saying our mosque in this foreign style is, is Chinese. The mosque wasn't demolished, but it was significantly renovated. So I can show you some photos. Let me start actually with a photo from the 1930s. This is the original Huizhou Mosque, which didn't survive the Mao era. It was in the Chinese style. It was only in 2016, as the mosque was being constructed, that it was being built in this kind of foreign, not indigenous mosque style. And you can see here very clearly, because it hasn't been completed yet, where the various minarets and other things are going to go on the side of the mosque. This is what it looked like in February 2019 before the renovations happened. And here's what it looked like after. Basically, the domes were taken down and a whole new roof was put on. This is the quote unquote Sinicized view of the Huizhou Grand Mosque. Now, you may be wondering, what do all these changes mean for the ability of Yinchuan to play a central role in Chinese cultural diplomacy? And there's sort of a two-part answer to that question. On the one hand, any Arab visitor who was coming and being impressed by the affinity that people there felt for Arabic, by people learning Arabic, by signs of the Arabic language, by mosque architecture that would be recognizably Middle Eastern, that's gone. So you don't go there anymore and think, oh, this reminds me of home. You can't. But visitors still from the Middle East are still taken there. And they're still taken, not to any of these Sinicized mosques, but to the Najihu Mosque, the same one they'd always gone to. They skip the Hui Culture Park, drive straight to the mosque nearby, and go and look at this Chinese-style mosque. Because as the emphasis has come more and more on the notion of Islam as an indigenous religion to China with local characteristics, Chinese hosts of foreign visitors have doubled down on that aspect, which has indeed always been part of the messaging. And so they're still going to the Najihu Mosque and they're still meeting the same imam there. And they're still having the same conversation. And this notion of Islam being indigenous to China is actually really attractive to people from certain contexts, particularly if you imagine somebody from Arab countries like, let's say, Egypt, who are writing in official venues with the sanction of the Egyptian government. They're coming, and the notion of not necessarily religion, but transnational manifestations of religion and foreign influence on religion, the notion that that is subsumed and subordinated to an indigenous religion that is in harmony with local characteristics and under the control of the state is really, really attractive. And so in that sense, on either side of the 2018 divide, Yinchuan retains some manner of its relevance. What's interesting to look at going forward is what consequences it will have for the enthusiasm that I mentioned. When I visited the Najihu Mosque, I was there in 2015, and just wandering through, there was an Arabic classroom in the mosque on display, and I had paid admission to go and look around. I mean, these kids were being displayed for tourists, but they were also so enthusiastic to be there learning Arabic, preparing for their kind of state-sanctioned roles as China's ambassadors to the Middle East. And as those opportunities have been tamped down, the interesting question going forward is, what happens to that enthusiasm? So that's what I will be watching going forward. All right, I will leave it there. Thank you very much. And I'd be happy to take any questions.